The interesting thing is Trump and him were bitter rivals during the primary.
That's for sure.
You know, Trump made it very clear he wanted to destroy DeSantis during the primary. His chief of staff, or his incoming chief of staff, Susie Wiles, was a big part of making sure DeSantis did not succeed during the primary. Obviously, they might be getting over that.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by national political correspondent Mabinty Quarshie. Mabinty, President-elect Trump has been rolling out a lot of nominees. There's been some complications with some of them. Some of them are meeting with senators, trying to win over people. What's the status right now of some of the more challenging nominations, perhaps?
I'm going to start with the one who's really in the news after Matt Gaetz withdrew his nomination. And so we're gonna talk about Pete Hegseth, who is Trump's nominee for Secretary of Defense. He's really embattled right now. There's been this drip of negative stories coming up against him, but he's not backing down. He's been on the Hill meeting with senators. You know, he published a Wall Street Journal article, or I should say opinion piece, you know, defending his nomination and, you know, basically saying this is a smear attack. He went on the Megyn Kelly podcast to defend himself. His mother went on Fox News to defend his nomination. You know, he's basically pushing back against, you know, the allegations from 2017 of sexual assault. He's pushing back against some media reports that, you know, he might have been drinking on the job. And for what it's worth, Trump, you know, ostensibly says he's behind him. The issue, however, is that there are several lawmakers waiting in the wings, and they're not quiet about it. And so the main one would be Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa, who's been very non-committal after meeting with Pete Hegseth, which is not necessarily the best thing you want, but, you know, if his nomination doesn't get through, she would be one of the contenders who could replace him. There is the surprise person, and I'm talking of Governor Ron DeSantis from Florida, who, you know, him and Trump met this week, and there's some speculation that he, you know, could replace Hegseth if it doesn't make it through. And the interesting thing is Trump and him were bitter rivals during the primary.
That's for sure.
You know, Trump made it very clear he wanted to, destroy DeSantis during the primary. His chief of staff, or his incoming chief of staff, Susie Wiles, was a big part of making sure DeSantis did not succeed during the primary. Obviously, they might be getting over that. And also, you know, if DeSantis were to replace Pete Hegseth, it scrambles Florida's politics, which is its own issue, and I can get to that later. And then there's another wild dark horse in this battle, but you know, I was talking to a few people, and they mentioned that Texas Congressman Wesley Hunt might also be in the running. And that's a little bit unusual because Pete Hegseth is still the nominee. And so to have at least 3 people, if not more, I've heard Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee might also be another contender. So it's not the most positive sign when there are several people's names bubbling up in the media as, you know, waiting to take over. But again, you know, Pete Hegseth is still pushing his nomination, and you know, there was some confusion about whether he had been summoned to Mar-a-Lago. You know, he says he hadn't been. He said he's on Capitol Hill and he's meeting with Republican senators. But we'll have to wait and find out. And if his nomination is pulled, you know, there are at least 3 to 4 people who are willing to replace him, and they have an easier path to Senate confirmation than he would.
So there was the question when Matt Gaetz withdrew of whether that would kind of open things up for other nominees, or whether it would sort of put blood in the water, and Republican senators who want to block some of the more controversial nominees now have greater incentive to do so. It does seem like Hegseth is now taking a lot of the heat.
Yeah, literally, maybe 2 days after his nomination was withdrawn, I actually did a story about who, you know, was going to be the brunt of focus, and Pete Hegseth was the top person, and mostly because, you know, Gaetz had to withdraw ostensibly about sexual assault allegations, which is what, you know, Pete Hegseth is dealing with. But also, the thing I didn't mention, which I should, is that he's also made some comments about how women should maybe not serve in combat roles. And, you know, Senator Joni Ernst, you know, she's a combat veteran. So it makes things a little bit complicated.
And a sexual assault victim.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out. So it's one of those things where, one little issue, he probably could have gotten away with it, but it's starting to be a little bit too much. It's starting to be too many different factors that are, you know, I don't want to say poisoning, but sort of dampening,
Complicating his path.
Complicating his path.
And there are only so many Republicans they
Right.
can lose if all Democrats vote against it.
Exactly. And again, you know, with the Gates withdrawal, it doesn't look good if too many Trump nominees don't make it through. So there's also that pressure of Senate Republicans seeming unified. And so, you know, if Pete Hegseth didn't make it through, I imagine that'd be the last one, right? I imagine the Trump camp would be very adamant for Senate, you know, Republicans to confirm the rest of his nominees, which might prove a little bit harder because we have folks like RFK Jr.
Right.
and Tulsi Gabbard, who also are facing a bit of a complicated path to Senate confirmation hearings.
So you mentioned Ron DeSantis. Even without Matt Gaetz, Trump is putting together a very Florida-heavy team, isn't he?
He sure is. I mean, we have Mike Waltz, you know, his nominee for National Security Advisor. Susie Wiles, who I mentioned, she's a veteran Florida political operative. And so the thing is DeSantis joins his administration, there becomes this scramble over the 2026 gubernatorial race in Florida.
Sure.
Because also I should mention, you know, Marco Rubio had been tapped as his Secretary of State. So there was speculation that Ron DeSantis...
Pam Bondi is
Yeah.
going to be Attorney General,
Yes.
most likely.
Absolutely. So there was, you know, there was speculation that DeSantis would appoint a placeholder for Rubio's Senate seat and then would run for it in 2026. But if he becomes Defense Secretary, he doesn't need to be a senator. He's in prime position to maybe challenge J.D. Vance for the 2028 presidential nomination. And then it becomes this musical chairs, right? Because, you know, by law, the lieutenant governor becomes governor, but I don't think a lot of people have a lot of confidence in Lieutenant Governor Jeanette Nunes. And then we have Matt Gaetz, who could be waiting in the wings.
Who had been talked about as a Florida gubernatorial candidate, Byron Donalds as well.
Yes, and I mean, these are very charismatic, popular people with deep roots in Florida. I mean, it could be a free-for-all come 2026 when it wasn't necessarily expected to be that.
Florida men and Florida women.
Yes.
Thank you, Mabinty.
Thank you.
You can read Mabinty and the rest of our political team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.